back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. This week, I'm joined by my friend Paul Kemper. Paul is a husband, a dad, an outdoorsman, the media guy for Fresh Tracks TV, a friend of mine, and a diabetic. There are several really great takeaways from my conversation with Paul that you may find really helpful to you, even if you're not a diabetic. For example, what if you train with someone who is? Do you know how to treat them if you're a long way from help and they need it? What if you're in the backcountry and you happen to find somebody who needs trouble? What if you yourself have problems with low blood sugars unrelated to diabetes during a training event, a hunt, a ski tour, anything else of that nature? Do you know how to take care of yourself and to get back to a place where you can get help? Paul and I talk through all of these things, plus a few resources that he's created through his brand, Wild Diabetic. It's a great conversation, and I think that you'll find several great takeaways that'll serve as an asset to you, personal skills as someone who enjoys time in the outdoors, whether you're a diabetic or not. Here's Paul Kemper, the Wild Diabetic.
Yeah, so I'm Paul Kemper. I live in Belgrade, Montana. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and I was introduced to the outdoors from my grandfather and my uncle. And so from probably maybe age 3, I started fishing, started shooting guns, probably about the same time against my mother's will. And then, I was shooting bows all my youth, and then started bow hunting when I was 13, killed my first deer, and just the hooks were set in. It was incredible, and I always looked up to my grandfather. My grandfather lived 4 blocks away, so we spent a ton of time together. It wasn't just like Easter and Christmas. It was every day. And when I'd get out of preschool, pops would pick me up and we'd go for a drive and hang turkey feeders or go fishing at the pond or whatever. And there was always a connection of love with the outdoors. It wasn't just a hobby, but it was, I'm doing this thing with this person that I admire so much. And my dad took me fishing, and my uncle. And it was always these men that I looked up to that loved me so much that they took me out to do these things. And so that was, the early foundations. And so, went to college. I studied journalism and wildlife and fishery science, and then got an internship in Montana and packed up my car and moved out. And, now I'm the marketing manager for Fresh Tracks with Randy Newberg. And I'm the vice president of the Traditional Bow Hunters of Montana and the founder of Wild Diabetic.
I definitely want to get into Wild Diabetic for a lot of reasons. But one of the things I like as a dad who's got a 4-year-old, almost 4-year-old little boy, and then we've got another little guy who's just about to turn 1. And now that it's public, we can say that you're about to be a dad.
I am going to be a dad. Yeah.
I think like everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people are really, really interested in, obviously, like when you love something so much, you want to give that to your kids. And obviously, like there's this fine line of, and I'm not there yet. I don't know how to do this. Maybe I'll screw it up when I get there. But between not pushing it on them, not pushing them into it because you want them to have it so bad, but you do want them to have it. And I think the thing that you said is enlightening to me as a dad is like, there was always this undertone of like just being with people you loved, and it happened to be doing stuff outdoors. It wasn't like, all right, son, put your boots on, we're going for a 12-miler. If you want to be in backcountry shape someday and want to see big bucks, you got to get out now. It was just like, yeah, we went to the ponds, or we hung turkey feeders, or we just went out and took binoculars and looked for whatever, right? And I think that is a really good thing, at least for me, to remember in terms of trying to get my own kids involved with outdoors.
Yeah, totally. I feel like, obviously I'm not a dad yet, but your life is not about you. And so if you're trying to make it about you and push that on them, I know that when I was age 11, probably to 18, my dad told me to do something. There's a good chance I wasn't doing it. But facilitating that, providing the opportunity, and providing that that opening for them to experience something awesome. The primal depths, the feelings that come out of there when you hook into a fish or that bobber goes under. It doesn't have to be necessarily a steelhead trip in Washington in the freezing cold. It can be Fourth of July at the pond, and and you build on that. It's just like anything. It's that slow building, kind of at you know the person's pace or the child's pace. I feel like.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, and I mean that's a good transition too, because before we even started really recording, we talked a little bit. I mean, we know each other through you starting this thing called Wild Diabetic, which I definitely want to dive into. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on is so you could explain what that is, because it is, and I think will keep being a really great resource for people either A, who have diabetes, who get diagnosed with diabetes, and them getting an understanding of how to deal with this and not give up their life. But I think second, it could be for anyone interested. Um, if a loved one or like your hunting partner or whatever gets diagnosed, how do you manage it? What can you do to be a support person? So I thought you'd be just a spectacular person to talk about that. Can you talk a little bit about when you got your diagnosis, some of the thoughts that went through your mind, some of the preconceived notions that maybe you had um, when you got diagnosis? Of course, that's probably changed over time, but just what that looked like being a person who really enjoyed the outdoors, specifically going away from the road, and how to manage all of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I was diagnosed, I don't think I didn't have any preconceived notions. I don't think, because I didn't know what diabetes was. I was 5 years old. And so for me, it was just like a lot of scary stuff happening at once. Um, I guess I knew there was going to be, major changes in my life, but I don't think I had any idea really what those were going to be. And my parents aren't particularly adventurous people. And so maybe that kind of played into some of my rebellion in my teenage years or whatever. But played it pretty safe. Like growing up, I fished a lot. They would be like, "Hey, do you want to play soccer?" I'd be like, "I'm bass fishing." Like I don't want to do that. You want to play baseball? Not really. Whatever. And so yeah, as I got older, I wanted to play football. I started playing football in seventh grade, I think, and it was just kind of like this learning process. I didn't know a diabetic who played football. And so there's the when do you take your pump off? When do you give insulin? How do you manage? And a lot of that was just like hard learned lessons, trial and error. A lot of nights in the bathtub after a game with my legs cramped straight because, I didn't have my pump on during the game and not enough insulin that, my blood sugar, the stress of the game, lack of insulin, I'd have a 450 blood sugar at the end of 4 quarters and I'd be chugging pickle juice to try and get these cramps to go away. And a lot of like painful, crappy nights after games. And but you learn, and it's like, okay, maybe at halftime I got to give a little bit of insulin. I got to make sure I'm staying on top of my numbers. And it really was just like it's a continuous learning process. You never have it mastered. You never you can always get better. And that's something that kind of hit me hard this fall as well, where I was just struggling with big swings. I I'd miscalculate or mistime a bolus for a meal. I'd spike and then it wouldn't want to come down. I'd give more insulin and then I'd have these plummeting crashes. And I was just like feeling pretty dejected. And it was interesting. I had to refill my insulin prescription. It was my first time on my new insurance getting insulin, and I needed prior authorization to get Novolog, which I've been using since I was in fourth grade. I started using an insulin pump in fourth grade. So I'm trying to think how many years that is. Maybe 15-ish years or more that I've been using Novolog. All of a sudden I can't use it. They want me to switch to Humalog. And I was so frustrated. I had all these frustrations mounting with, the less than stellar control of my blood sugar. And then the insurance company wants to tell me what I can and can't use to manage my diabetes. Like, oh, I was livid. And I get Humalog, I start using it. I'm like, wow, I've got much better control over my sugars. I'm still upset that the insurance company was telling me what I can and can't do, but it was a blessing in disguise. It was like all of a sudden I didn't need to be so aggressive with, correcting for high blood sugars, or, just had greater stability and less crashes at night. And, I'm 28 now. And so 23 years later, I learned something new that has dramatically impacted my control of my diabetes. And you have to be open to that. You have to be open to kind of going on that journey. And that's, kind of part of what Wild Diabetic is about, is in some of those cases, hopefully shortening the learning curve, that you don't need to go through all the ups and downs that I went through over the years.
I guess so. I have two questions that come off of that. For people who aren't necessarily familiar between the different types, how would you like? What would you say the differences between type one and type two?
I don't know if this is like up to date with maybe ADA definitions, but just for like the common person, I typically say that type 1 diabetes is genetic, and type 2 is oftentimes more a lifestyle disease. Obviously, there's genetic predispositions towards that, but mine's an autoimmune disorder. And when I was 5, I had a really nasty flu virus, and my white blood cells essentially got confused, and instead of attacking the flu, attacked the islet cells in my pancreas. Um, the thing about that is that a lot of the symptoms of the flu are very similar to the onset symptoms of diabetes. And so my parents for a while thought I just had this like nasty lingering flu. And um, until one night I passed out in the bathroom floor, and like, this is not the flu. And, went to the hospital and got my diagnosis, and we were off to the races. Um, but a lot of times you hear that type 2 can be controlled with diet and exercise. I require insulin every day to stay vertical.
That I think that's one of the main key features is like so type one. I mean, you have to take insulin, which and this is going to be my next question for you, but brings about its own unique set of challenges, particularly when you start going out and doing a lot of hiking, a lot of high output activity. Type two can require medications to manage. But oftentimes it doesn't require medications to manage. I can think of somebody right now who was in program or whatever, was diagnosed type 2. He did the work to make significant changes, and now his A1C, which is a measure of your diabetes and how well it's controlled or not controlled, and a measure of diagnosis, looks like as though he never had diabetes. Now, people will often say that, like, oh yeah, it's I don't have diabetes anymore. It's like, well, it's always kind of present. It's just managed, right? It's really well controlled for
Right.
type 2. Type 1 though, and you hit the nail on the head, and I mean, you're the expert in this. I think that one of the main differences is the fact that you've got to have this extra insulin because the organ responsible for making it doesn't work as well as it did, and for you was because of this illness. What, if in your mind, what are like, if you could narrow it to three, and maybe you would even narrow it to one, maybe you would box it into five, number doesn't matter. What are the main things that you've got to keep at the forefront of your mind if you're going to go out on a 2-3 day trip? And I guess we could weave into this. If I were going to be going out with you, like let's say you're my hunting partner, what should I know? What should I know as I go out with you to pay attention to watch out for, to help with if you start to struggle?
One, I'm super blessed that my probably most frequent hunting partners are my wife and one of my really good buddies who's also type 1 diabetic. So we're always like trading snacks when we need them, and we know what to look for just because we've both been in the ball game for a while. Um, but I remember when I didn't start, backpack hunting. I did a couple overnighters in college. Like I said, I grew up in Pennsylvania, so it was not big country. But I did a few overnighters in central Pennsylvania, but it really started when I moved to Montana. And so, not that everything I knew didn't matter, but I now had to put a whole new lens on it. And I remember one of my buddies who I hunted with, his wife was a nurse, and she was always so nervous for both of us, I suppose, of him going hunting with me because of, the extra risks, associated with having diabetes when you don't necessarily have access to all the medical attention. And so the big things for me are just like, you have to know your body. You have to know how you feel, at your basal level, and then at high outputs, and, in those different scenarios. If you've never, pushed yourself really hard before, you should know the difference between being tired from working hard and tired from you're going loopy because your blood sugar is plummeting. Um,
So hold on,
and
real quick, and sorry to interrupt you, but
oh, go ahead.
you said something that I think was key. Question that I'll get a lot, like on the Instagram Q&As, is how do I know if what I'm experiencing is just me being out of shape and the hunt's really hard versus I've got a low blood sugar? And I'd love to hear your answer, and then I'll tell you how I answer it. We'll see if they line up. And people should probably go with what you say over me, but
No, it's different for every person. A lot of it I think is kind of personality driven. And so it's good to hunt with friends that know kind of how you handle stress and in different situations. Um, for me, one thing I tell my friends that I'm hunting with is like, if they think I'm, because a lot of times if they just say, "How you doing?" I am like a head down and go no matter what. Like, ignore the pain, ignore the whatever, just go. And so, oh, I'm doing great. Like, whether I've got blisters or my legs want to fall off, I'm saying, yeah, I'm doing great. Because that's the way to get through, tough hunts or tough whatever. But I'll tell people to ask me to tell them a joke, because I have kind of one joke it's like a very just fun, lighthearted, clean joke that my grandpa used to tell. And if I can't move through that joke well, I'm probably not in a good place, because my one thing I notice when my blood sugars are low is that I struggle to communicate clearly. I take lots of short pauses. I can't, like, the synapses are not firing like I want them to. And so I'm always reaching and struggling to find the next word. It's a lot of ums and meandering and baloney. And maybe I'm umming and meandering right now. So maybe I got a little much sugar. But that kind of like, it's the mental side of it is more than the physical side of it. There's just like a lot, it's difficult to do tasks, and I get frustrated, and so the joke thing is just like, "Hey Paul, tell me a joke." Like, you should have some Skittles. The other thing is, like, I'm a pretty big guy, and so I'm very good at keeping my course and walking a straight line. And so if you see me starting to wobble a little bit and meander on the trail, that's a pretty good giveaway. I was hunting with two buddies. Oh man, might have been 2017, and we were way back in Grizz country, and both of their headlamps died. And so I'm leading the pack, and they're following me down this mountain, and I'm starting to just weave and bob down this hill trying to get back to the trail. And my buddy goes, "Hey, are you okay?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm great." He goes, "Well, you're wobbling a lot. Let's check your sugar." Sat down. I think I was like 42. Crushed a bag of Skittles, gave it 15 minutes, checked again. Things were coming up. All right, let's go. All of a sudden, back in a straight line. And so I think a lot of it is kind of just, a lot of it's like very, I would say it's kind of almost low key, where sometimes it could be hard to maybe pick up on things if you don't know the person, where like it's kind of like little changes. But for me, I just recognize it because my mental acuity drops. Um,
and that's exactly what I've always said. I've said, if like, to me, the dividing line is if your mental clarity is gone, you can't think clearly, you can't form sentences, you're really struggling in that sense, that's probably low blood sugar. If you've got pretty good mental clarity, you've got good awareness, you know where you're at, you're able to communicate where you're at. If someone's asking like directionally where you're headed, it's probably something unrelated to a low blood sugar. You could chalk that up to, quote unquote, not being in shape, or maybe it's just a tough, steep hike, whatever. But to me, that's kind of the dividing line. So number one, you got to tell the joke before we sign off because everybody's going to want to know what the joke
Oh
is.
man.
And then number two, you said a couple of key things there that I think are worth hitting on. Not maybe for people who are diabetic but don't know how to deal with this when they go out, or maybe they're like getting ready to go on their first big quote unquote Western hunt and they have this and they're not sure how to manage it. You said a couple things. You said, when I get low blood sugars, I need to eat Skittles. Why Skittles? Number two, you said, I sit down and I wait 15 minutes. What's the magic with 15? And I suppose that in addition to this would be the question, um, with the why Skittles? Why that specifically?
Honestly, I should stop eating Skittles because I don't know. Skittles were, as a younger person, there was always the things your mom wouldn't let you have, as a young diabetic. So like Trix cereal, that's one of my guilty pleasures because we would go to the store. I'd be like, Mom, I want Trix, and she'd be like, No, you can get Cheerios. And obviously, when I was younger, and especially when I was taking injections versus an insulin pump, it was brutal trying to just using injections and trying to manage, a high sugar treat like that. Um, and Skittles was another one. And so I like Skittles, and that's kind of my go-to. You can get the glucose tabs and the chalky whatever, and at the end of the day, it's like, man, I got to deal with this day in and day out. It's 24/7, 365. Um, I really do my best to stay positive and not let diabetes, steal from my joy. But there is a lot of BS that I'm just damn this disease. And and so like little things like that, I'm like, yeah, I am going to treat myself. If I got to feel like garbage for, 25 minutes until my blood sugar levels out and comes back to normal, then I'm going to enjoy my my pick me up. Um so yeah, that's why Skittles.
That is a like the word pick me up is right. So like as a diabetic, and feel free to elaborate this on as much as you want something that's going to be pretty high in carb, right? And you can explain why that is if you want. So I'm sure that there's no like magic behind the Skittles, but I guess the better question I should have asked is why choose something high in carbs to bring that up?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just carbs, right? It's what kind of carbs, what kind of sugar are you taking in? Um, and I was actually speaking with a guy, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago about, he kept crashing while he was hiking in, and I have the same issue. And he's like, well, I'm eating, Skittles or gummy bears or whatever it is. And I said, well, are you having anything complex to follow it up and kind of give you something to, stabilize it? He's like, no. I said, well, dude, you got to get some peanut butter crackers, a granola bar, something that has a little bit more complexity. And so, when you're diagnosed with diabetes and they say when you have a low glucose, you take 15 grams of carbs, wait 15 minutes, test again, and repeat. And, the reality is, when I've got a 45-pound bag and I'm going like this, uphill, I'm not I'm not trying to incrementally just inch my way to it. So I want something that's quick that I can try and get that response going and then hopefully stabilize it with something a little bit more complex. Um, Even like after, if I've got a tough workout, I want to make sure that I'm having like a small amount of complex carbs, but some protein too before I go to bed, to help prevent those dips at night, kind of when you stop, if you're going for a walk, you're not burning the same calories when you stop walking. But if were pushing a heavy squat or carrying a heavy bag for a while, your body's going to continue to burn. And so that's something that I notice, personally, is just like nighttime lows on hard training days, and trying to figure out kind of that concoction that allows you to stabilize a little better. And so for immediate, quick, fast acting treatment, whatever, floats your boat that is a simple sugar that'll get in your system ASAP is going to do the job. But it's important to not just, spike that blood sugar up and then start crushing again uphill And, 30 minutes later, you're sitting again, for it to come up again. And you get in this cycle of up and down and up and down. And that just makes you feel like garbage. You're not going to perform as well. Your brain's not going to be all there. You're going to be distracted. Um, Having something on board that's complex will help you just continue on that path.
Right. So kind of what you're highlighting is when you're incredibly active, your body is taking any carbohydrate that it's got and utilizing it as fuel. And so that's what can cause the blood sugar to dip so low. So you combat that by giving some Skittles as an immediate source to bring that up so you can start thinking clearly. It'll provide you some fuel too, but then throw in a complex carbohydrate because complex carbohydrates break down a little slower. So now you've got kind of this really great combination of fast acting carbs to bring it up quick, complex carbs to delay that delivery over time. It's kind of the best world. And like I think you'd mentioned it a minute ago, the rule of 15, which is why you said I sit down and I wait for 15 minutes. I just think that these are, I mean, those in my mind would be like the best thing a hunting partner or a newly diagnosed diabetic or somebody who's maybe not taken on something really high exertion, good things to know, because one thing that I see floating around a lot on forums is people who have any sort of an insulin or glucose issue. It's like, oh, I need to be sure that I take lots of nuts and lots of jerky on this hunt, keep it low carb. And it's like, oh man, no, because as you start, like you'd highlighted, as you start climbing, that blood sugar is going to dip really, really low. And you'd mentioned earlier, yeah, too, I think it's good to remember the weight of a pack would be the equivalent of doing a heavy workout. And so, yeah, your body requires fuel to, like you use squats, for example. It requires some fuel to do that squat, but something's got to recover the muscle. So when you stop, the carbohydrates you've consumed, the protein you consume, etc., it's not like it just stops. It's still going to that muscle. And so that's why it's important to stay on top of the fueling too. And I mean, honestly, I don't know if those were your two or three when I'd asked you earlier, but I don't know of a better two or three than that. That's pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is like for diabetics is I feel like when I started out, I felt like I had something to prove and that I didn't want to give myself the time I needed to recover from a low like I should. I didn't want to be a hindrance on someone else's hunt. And so I would just push and I'd, just be crushing gummies down the trail. Um, and just so I could keep going. And it was like I was a vacuum and just inhaling calories as I'm going. And, I think I kind of came to realize that, my buddies aren't going to be pissed if we take 10, 15 minutes just to sit down and catch our breath and let things get where they need to be, not try and force it. Um, I've gotten pretty good at being quiet with rappers, but twice this year, inside 100 yards on elk, and set my bow down and reached in my pocket and like got out some snacks and ate them quick because I knew if things happened and we got into a stalemate a little bit, I might not be able to do that. And so trying to get ahead of it and plan and allow, for me, my diabetes to kind of fall into my process of how I approach a stock or a hunt or a calling setup. Um, so that it isn't a hindrance. I remember I got a new insulin pump. I switched brands in 2018, and the let's see, it was like the second week I had it. I was new to the continuous glucose monitor, new to that pump, and my buddy's calling this bull in for me, and he's coming down the hill, and I'm up ahead, and all of a sudden, my pump's going off, everything's beeping. I don't know how to turn anything off. I think I ate every snack in my backpack and just hoping that this thing would be quiet. Bull ended up blowing out, and then as we're hiking out, my blood sugar just spiking straight up, and I was like, "You gotta be kidding me! Like this is the worst. I hate this stupid thing." But the CGM and the pump have been absolute game changers, like life changing technology for me.
Yeah, but I mean, I think It's good information. So, like continuous glucose monitors and pumps, because you've referenced those a few times. Historically, people would have to stop. They'd have to prick themselves. They'd have to check their blood sugar. They'd have to pull out then, a separate needle, a bottle of insulin, give themselves the correct injection dose to fix whatever that blood sugar in. CGM, which is continuous glucose monitors, I'd be curious about something after I finish this. Basically, is a constant monitoring of what your blood sugar is, and if it experiences any highs or lows, there's insulin in that pump that can be delivered and fix it. And like the other really nice thing about it is they keep this log of data. So if you go see a doctor, if you go see a dietitian, or at this point you're probably more educated than a lot of doctors and dietitians out there, but they can help give you some wisdom on maybe how to fix that. This might be a rabbit hole. What's your thoughts on non-diabetics all of a sudden buying glucose monitors to test their blood sugars for quote unquote optimal health and that whole thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I honestly, like, in my life, I'm pretty laissez-faire, like live and let live. The only time I'd really have a problem with it is when people who need them lose access to it because it's being consumed by people who recreationally want to use a CGM. I think there's a ton of great value, a lot of great information that you can gain from tracking your sugars, especially after a meal, understanding how different foods impact your glucose levels in different ways. Um, but the other side of it is that, like, I would argue that there's testing windows that if someone wanted to like prick their finger and check their blood sugars after, to get some insight. I don't know if it requires you to use a continuous glucose monitor, where if you're a normal functioning person whose pancreas is firing on all cylinders, you're going to know what the answer is. Like, you're going to be within a certain range. And that, that's kind of just how the human body works. So, I've seen the same thing with Ozempic, which is, I'm not super familiar with the medicine itself. But I've heard that some diabetics are struggling to get a hold of Ozempic. But it's been like this fad diet medicine for weight loss. And not that, weight loss isn't a noble cause, that may require some medicine. But when, diet and exercise is an appropriate starting approach to getting control of your weight, and then diabetics who require that medicine are struggling to get a hold of it, that's where it becomes a problem. And so, like, the data is, I won't say I'm a health nut, but I love strength training. I love fitness. And so I love seeing the data of how different foods impact me. And so, just from like a take diabetes out of it, it's very cool to see that graph and to try to understand, more about yourself. But like I said, if someone wants to do it, it's not that I have a problem with them doing it. It would, the problem would come from if diabetics struggle to then access that resource because of a recreational use versus a, medical use.
I think but yes, I agree with that 100%. I think anybody who's logical would. um, but I also think you got to have a pretty in-depth knowledge of blood sugars and what's going to cause them to rise and fall, and monitoring trends, etc. Because otherwise, you just got a bunch of data you don't know what to do with, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's like having Strava, or it's like having a really nice watch, or that tracks a bunch of training metrics, or even something that tracks like lifting metrics. It's like, well, yeah, the data is really great, but the data is only as good as what you can do with it. So, like prime example, if you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor, you go and do some sort of let's call it a high intensity effort, like hiking up a hill. You get to the top of that hill and it's, holy smokes, my blood sugar is high. Well, high intensity efforts can also push blood sugars high. Or if you get
Yeah.
sick, right? If you get sick and you've eaten what you deem this pristine meal and your blood sugar's high, and you're like, well, geez, what? Maybe I need less carbs. I should cut the spinach out. It's like, you're sick. Blood sugars are always high when you're sick.
Well,
You
I
have to
mean,
have
that's great.
context.
The last, that's a really great point. I'm just kind of getting over having some crud this past weekend, and I'm feeling better. But for 3 days, my blood sugars were sitting, and I was just on the couch resting at like 160, and on that graph, it's like a state line, straight line. On an average day, I'm like 110, you know, and so just that stress of the body fighting off the cold is going to potentially elevate your blood sugar, and it's affected the way I bolus for meals. When I eat something, I'm definitely more aggressive, and I have to be patient with giving that dose of insulin and then waiting 15, 20 minutes for it to get a head start before I jump in, because otherwise it's going to go up. And it was just really interesting to watch that last few days. It's been on my mind.
Yeah. I want to jump into, we may not get time for the joke. I want to jump into Wild Diabetic because that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this. Tell me, we talked a little bit about it before we, officially recorded or whatever, but what is Wild Diabetic and what's your ultimate hope with it?
Yeah, Wild Diabetic right now it's a social page on Instagram and a blog on the website, thewilddiabetic.com. Uh, my goal is just to have a resource from a real life diabetic who has made a lot of mistakes, but figured a lot of things out that worked for myself. I never got down and out about my diabetes. Like I definitely have gotten down and felt dejected and felt those things. But I want to be able to share that with people who either have been looking for someone who has gone through the same thing, or, for new diabetics who are just wondering like how their life is going to change or how they can continue to live an active lifestyle. And, like we had spoken about before with, learning the lessons about insulin while playing football, or, how I pack food for a 3 day backpack hunt. Um, a lot of that was trial and error. And for people, if a diabetic doesn't have to be afraid of, backcountry camping or hunting or whatever, and can make informed decisions or reach out and ask a question and have a resource, you know, essentially, just like you would a buddy. But the thing is, I've now met a lot of type 1 diabetics around me, that are my friends. But when I got started, it was like, I know how to recover from a low blood sugar. I know how to eat. So I'm just going to pack a ton of stuff. I think my first backpack hunt, my backpack weighed close to 70 pounds. And I didn't have any money. So it wasn't like I had ultralight backpacking meals. I had like cans of tuna and like all sorts of BS. But I was so afraid of running out of low blood sugar stuff. I had no idea what to expect. And I packed like 2 days extra food. It was just, it was all, but I made it. I did, 3 nights, 4 days. We saw elk. It was amazing. It was like a fundamental, core memory, life changing experience. And I was kind of like, holy crap, I can do this. Um, but I got to get better at it. And so, yeah, it's just a resource to, for me, a creative outlet to, talk about my diabetes that hopefully helps people, lower that barrier of entry, or to educate people on how just to live like the fullest, best life they can as a diabetic, and not let diabetes be like this, the hammer to fall on the rest of your life. Because I've done some pretty sweet things in my 23 years as a type 1 diabetic.
That to me was one of the things that stood out the most is, often, and I got a lot more of this when I worked in the hospital versus now, but like people get that diagnosis and basically think everything's got to stop, right? Like I can't do anything enjoyable anymore. And, I only know that I only know that to be untrue, from the nerdy side of science and data, and know that if you manage it well, theoretically it'll work out and you have a normal life. You know it from an entirely different standpoint that I think only a person with diabetes who does these things can go do them. And so I knew about it. I knew you are super passionate about it, and I love that. It really, I mean, I love anything that basically says, no, 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 that's not true. Here's what is true. You can live you can still do all the things that you wanted to do. I think that's great. So I'll be sure to link the blog and stuff like that in the show notes. Before we let you go, I think we got time for both of these. One, you got to tell the joke, at least at the end. And then two, if you've got one off the top of your head, favorite Randy Newberg story
Oh man. Um,
that won't get you fired.
no, actually, okay. So when I was in college, I did an internship with Field and Stream and Outdoor Life. And in July, there's the ICAST show, which is the international whatever. It's the fishing trade show. It's the SHOT Show of fishing. And so as an intern, I was down in Orlando shooting and editing videos, kind of turn and burn. It was a very fun trip. And on that trip, over that time, I believe, is when Randy had released that wolf episode, which was like very controversial when it came out. It was right when wolf hunting was, legalized in Montana. And I had messaged Randy on Facebook, and I said, "Hi, Randy. I'm a big fan. I do some filming myself, and right now I'm doing this and that, whatever. Just thank you so much for being a great, you know, role model and representative for hunters. I really appreciate you, tackling something that's controversial and just representing us all so well." And I thought it would, go into the ethers, never hear back. But I was like, I gotta reach out to Randy. And like 10 minutes later, ping, Randy responds, and we had gone back and forth a few exchanges for probably about a half hour. 2020, I got laid off in the spring when the pandemic started. And then, towards the end of July, I was like, hey, you should apply for this job. We're looking to hire someone. And, Randy and I go get coffee, and we have the interview or whatever. And we're talking. He's like, I said, I don't know if you remember, Randy, but like 6 years ago, I had messaged you on Facebook, um, just saying that I was like a big fan and grateful. And it's just really cool to be here in this position. And he goes, oh yeah. He goes, I was reading back to those messages last night, and that was a moment for me where I was like, man, like this guy's a real guy.
Yeah.
It really meant a lot, but it was just really cool that what you see is what you get. And yeah, that was pretty cool.
I love, I mean, I didn't know that story before now, but I love it because you get this vibe about him. You get vibes about anybody who's in the public eye, really in any space, not just hunting. But I think if anybody's honest, there's always this dose of curiosity of like, is that really you? And you
Yeah.
get this vibe with Randy, at least I always have. It's like, that's really you. Like I could picture you being a buddy of my dad's. So
For sure.
it's cool to hear that's true. So appreciate you
Yeah.
sharing it. All right, man. We got a couple of minutes. Tell us the joke.
So this is back in old country Italy, and there's this young man, and he had just got married. He's walking down the the country road, and he sees this old man. There's this horse standing out in the pasture, and the young man walks by, and he goes, "Sir, that's the most beautiful horse I've ever seen. I've got to have it." And the old man says, "Yeah, looks so good." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "He's stunning. Look at him." He goes, I'm trying to, I was just married, trying to start a family. That horse could really help me till the fields and get our life started." And he goes, looks so good." The young man said, "Sir, please, please let me buy this horse from you. I I can't go on without this horse." And the old man said, "I'll sell him to you, but looks so good." The young man buys the horse, and he takes it back, and the horse is in the stable and staring at the wall, won't turn, won't do anything. He's just standing there staring. He takes it out in the pasture and he tries to wave it over, and it just stands there. And he's just like, what the heck is up with this horse? And so he goes back to the old man, and he goes, "Sir, I think you sold me a blind horse." And he goes, "I told you, looks so good."
You did it well, man. I think your blood sugars are great.
Yeah, I think they're good.
I'm gonna use it on my wife.
Well, I love having that joke in my arsenal. It's not the best joke ever told.
It's a
but
great joke, man. It's
it
perfect.
it's a good joke. It's a fun story, and it's just like it's clean. I feel like sometimes you get in these like campfires with new people, or you know, different scenarios where people like tell a joke, and then someone like whips out this like raunchy joke, and you're like, "Gosh, dude, there's kids 20 feet away. Like, watch it."
Hmm.
And it's just nice that like it's lighthearted, and even if it doesn't get the biggest laugh, you're like, well, I tried and I didn't hurt anyone's feelings. So
You know what I think it's going to become? I think it's going to become like the gold standard in the backcountry for testing blood sugars without a glucometer.
the
It's
horse
to be like,
story.
yeah, it's going to be like, you know what? We don't have a glucometer. He doesn't look good. Tell the joke. Somebody get him to tell
Yeah.
the joke. Paul, thanks for coming, man, and appreciate what you're doing for Wild Diabetic, and like I feel almost stupid saying I feel appreciate what you're doing for diabetics everywhere because it just classifies like it puts people in this like the box that no one wants to be in. So I don't want to say that, but at the same time, like I know it'll be such a help to the folks who do have it, who have diabetes, and it'll be a great help to folks like me who maybe hunt with someone who does, or somebody who's preparing to. Maybe it's not even hunting. Maybe it's whatever. Maybe they want to do an ultra and they come across this and they learn a thing or two. So I just appreciate you, and I appreciate you what you're doing here. It's very selfless, and I know you're passionate about it. So I'm excited to see what comes from it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, dude. Yeah, it's like I tell people that you don't want to be defined by diabetes. Like it shouldn't be your personality trait, but you should definitely try and define diabetes and live your life that way. Like kick ass, take names, do awesome stuff, and show like what you're capable of as a person who has diabetes.
I love it, dude. Big thanks to Paul for joining me this week and giving us such practical tips on the topic. If you want to reach out to Paul, you can find out all of his contact information at the links in the bio or search Wild Diabetic. If you enjoyed the podcast yourself, would you consider just taking a couple of minutes, ranking it in your podcast platform, leaving us a comment, or maybe you know someone who would like this podcast or other episodes that we've done? You could just pass that along to them. We'd be very grateful for that. Thanks for joining us again this week. We'll be back again with another episode here in a couple weeks. And as always, if there's topics that you want to hear us discuss, you can shoot those ideas over to us at info@v2pnutrition.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll have a great week.